many differences between chimpanzees and human beings. Multiple choice, last one. If a person compromises the literal history of Genesis 1, then what is the result? A, he has no other problems with the Bible beyond the first chapter. Or B, he has problems with Paul. Or C, he has problems with Jesus. Or both B and C. I'm bad about, if I ever put both this and that, that's usually the answer, isn't it? I'm bad about that. So I need to make it a little bit more difficult for you, but that's the correct answer. You got problems with Paul and Jesus too. And not just them, but also Peter and the author of Hebrews. Okay, so here's the Apologetics Press website. I've been bringing this up every week to notify you that there's a lot of good material on this subject of creation versus evolution, which is our subject for the quarter. I want to bring to your attention, and I don't know if we've really talked about this, the field of apologetics is a lot broader than just the creation-evolution issue. The word apologetics comes from a Greek word that means a defense or a reason. It's used, for example, in 1 Peter 3:15 that says that we should sanctify the Lord Christ in our hearts and be ready always to give an answer or an apologetic. That's what the word is, a reason for the hope that lies within us. So the field of apologetics is an area where we study about giving reasons for the convictions we hold as Christians. So sometimes we might say something like this: why do we believe what we believe? If a person in the world asks that question, why do you believe such and such? Well, an apologetic is a defense of what we believe. And you could give an apologetic for anything. It's not a word peculiar to Christianity. You could defend whatever view you hold. Muslims can give apologetics for Islam, and Jews can give apologetics for Judaism. It's not a word particularly to Christianity. But we do need to have a Christian apologetic. And that's part Christian evidences or apologetics includes creation versus evolution. But there are other subjects too. Like, what if I wanted to defend the divinity of Jesus? Is that part of apologetics? What if somebody says, I don't believe Jesus is the Lord? Then I need to give an apologetic for Jesus. Or what if somebody says, the evil in the world proves that God doesn't exist? Because an all-loving, all-powerful God wouldn't allow there to be evil, pain, and suffering in the world. Well, then I need to give an apologetic for the existence of God in light of all of the wickedness and suffering in the world. And all kinds of things beyond that. What if someone says, I don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible because the Bible has all kinds of mistakes in it, or the Bible contradicts itself? And then we have to give an apologetic for the inspiration of the Bible. You see how there are many fields associated with this. And this is just one little bit of it. But you can find information about creation, evolution, and all these other topics, and many more, on that website. Okay, so anything that people do to try to devalue or disprove Christianity is going to be considered on that website, at least in some form or fashion. Tonight we're on December 18th, and we're talking about could evolution fit in the Bible? And then next week we won't have a class, and actually the week after that, because that's New Year's, we won't have a class. But we do have one more due to some scheduling issues. We've added one more class period on January the 8th, and that's where we will be responding to recent objections to creationism. Last week I left us at this point where we were going through the Bible and noticing how that if you compromise the literal history of Genesis 1, then you run into conflicts with not just Genesis 1, but other parts of the Bible as well. And we were particularly looking at what Paul said in a number of passages, including those where he says that Adam was the first man. Passages like 1 Corinthians 15:45, and how Adam was the one who brought human death into the world, that there was no human death prior to Adam, in Romans 5:10 through 12. And so that shows that when Paul discussed Adam, he talked about a literal man. So when Paul read the end of Genesis, he treated the creation of man and woman as being the literal first humans ever to live. And so we cannot disagree with Paul, can we, if we want to be Christians? We cannot disagree with Jesus. And truth be told, we cannot disagree with Moses either, because Moses was an inspired writer. And Jesus gave Moses full credit for being an accurate historian, as we saw at the end of class last week. Then notice that Peter treated Genesis as being literal history. And in particular, Peter focuses on what event? On 2 occasions in Peter's writing, he focused on what event? Big event in Genesis. The flood of Noah's day. And remember how we said that the first 11 chapters of Genesis, I think we said something to this effect last week, that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are particularly in the crosshairs of people who want to discredit the Bible. And the big 2 events that they especially focus on are the creation and the flood, because both of those are heavily miraculous, aren't they? And yet Peter gave great credence to the flood and even connected our baptism for the remission of our sins to the real flood of Noah's day, saying that 8 souls were saved by water. This is 1 Peter 3:20 and 21. And there is a like figure or a similar thing, which is baptism, which saves us. So 8 souls were saved by water in the days of Noah, and we are all saved by water in the watery grave of baptism. Think about how water saved Noah and his family. Water drowned everybody else, of course, who didn't die from the volcanoes or earthquakes or whatever was going on that was like that. But water drowned many of those people. But what did the water do to the ark? The water lifted it up above all that wreckage, didn't it? And the water actually was a protectant for Noah and his family. So water saved Noah, and water saves us. Not some kind of magic power in the water, but the blood of Christ at baptism washes those sins away. So Peter says baptism saves us. And that verse, of course, 1 Peter 3:21 is a big problem for anybody who says that baptism is inessential for salvation, because there's no way to get around it. In fact, I remember hearing about one of our brethren who was debating a denominational preacher one time, and the preacher for the Lord's church wrote on the blackboard. It was back when they were using a blackboard, but he wrote on the blackboard. He said, baptism also now saves us. And then on the other side of the blackboard, he wrote, baptism does not also now save us. And he asked his opponent in the debate to cross through the statement that he disagreed with. And he crossed through the statement that said, baptism also now saves us. And you know what our brother did when he got back up for the next speech? He said, my opponent just crossed out what the Apostle Peter said, because he crossed through 1 Peter 3:21 in the name of promoting his own doctrine. Isn't that a sad thing if somebody ever does that? But anyway, I just bring that up to say that whole argument about baptism, upon which we've rested in preaching about salvation for all these years, hinges on a comparison with Genesis 6 and 7. So if we don't take Genesis 6 and 7 as being literal history, then why would we take Peter's point, which is made by an illustration with Genesis 6 and 7, as being something we've got to go by? You see what I'm saying? His argument about baptism is based on a discussion of the flood in Genesis 6 and 7. And then also the Hebrews author treated Genesis as being literal history. And I gave you all these passages from Hebrews. I don't think we're going to take the time to look at these now, but if you want these slides, just let me know and I'll make sure you have them and you can run these references and see. And of course, the main text that comes to mind is Hebrews 11, because there's the discussion of patriarch after patriarch. And so the Hebrews writer looks back into biblical history and says, all these people really lived. And so Genesis is repeatedly cited as being literal in the Bible. The point of all this being that we are not at liberty to look at a text that is presented as being straightforward literal history in the Bible and wash it away and say, well, that really just didn't happen. Maybe it's a poetical or mythological thing. Even if the language of that passage would allow such an interpretation, the rest of the Bible doesn't. You see, we're going to talk about the language of Genesis 1, and we're going to say the word for day means a literal day in this passage. But even if You could make the language of Genesis 1 mean something that wasn't literal, like some poetical or metaphorical thing, so that the days are long ages of time or something like that. Even if you could do that, the rest of the Bible won't allow it. So you've got to go with the interpretation that the rest of the Bible puts on it. And so there are all kinds of people in the religious world today who will tell you, well, Genesis 1 doesn't really mean what it sounds like it means, that God created the universe in 6 literal days, 24-hour days. Those days could have been anything. You just don't know what day means in Genesis 1. That's a weird context. Well, let's grant that for a moment. Let's say it's hard to tell in Genesis. This is not true, but let's just say for the sake of argument, it's hard to tell what day means. You read Genesis 1, day might be 1,000,000 years. You just don't know what day means in the passage. Well, for our purposes, okay. The rest of the Bible clarifies it. And so while we will show that language to mean a literal day, the rest of the Bible gives us a lot of insight. Okay, any questions or comments along those lines before we move on? Okay, couple things. Yes, sir. Okay, we will get into it in some degree. Yes, sir. Right. Right. We do interpret the scriptures, and don't let interpretation in your mind be some kind of a negative thing, because all it means to interpret is just to draw meaning from it. And everybody's got to draw meaning from the Bible, otherwise it would be pointless to read it, wouldn't it? You draw meaning from it. But one of the principles of interpretation is that when God places an interpretation on a verse, then that's what it means. When God tells you one way or another, this is what this verse means, then you got to go with that, because God's in a position of authority. Or when one of the apostles does, or when Jesus says, here's what it means. And that's what we're trying to get us to see here, and I appreciate you making that point, is God has given us the interpretation of the passage. So we got to go with that. Very good. Okay. To be a Christian means I'm going to stand with Jesus and his inspired apostles on whatever they teach. So if Jesus says it's 6 24-hour days, as he indicated in Mark 10:6, then I stand with Jesus, don't you? Very good. Okay, I want to draw to your attention something from history, which is that evolutionary concepts were available to the writers of the New Testament if they had wanted to use them. This is important because they lived about 1,800 years prior to Darwin. But they could have involved some evolutionary concepts in their understanding of Genesis if they had wanted to. It was at their disposal. Sometimes we'll make this similar argument about instrumental music, where we will say the Christians in the first century could have used instrumental music in worship if they had wanted to. It was available. It was out there. Other people did, especially in Judaism, but they did not. And there was a principle about why they did not. It was because the apostles were teaching them otherwise. And when it comes to the issue of creation and evolution, evolutionary teaching was available. I've listed various views that are in some sense evolutionary, and these are what we might call the very earliest of the Greek philosophers, and they all had some idea about where everything came from. And this is oversimplified, but it's accurate, that Thales of Miletus said that everything evolved from water, that Anaximander said that everything evolved from the primordial mass, or a substance that was undifferentiated, and it was just a something from which everything else came. Anaximenes said that everything came from air. Xenophanes said that land animals evolved from fish, which is the same thing that modern evolutionary theory teaches. Heraclitus said that everything evolved from fire and everything is in a state of constant change. Empedocles said that everything evolved from the 4 elements. In Greek thought there were only 4 elements. And notice the dates on these people. They are all hundreds of years before Christ, aren't they? Before Jesus came. course, Christ existed as the second person of the Godhead from all eternity. But Jesus had not come to earth yet, had he? And yet, all these people are teaching evolution. I say that because when Paul talked about the origin of the world and life on earth, could he have picked one of these views and said, this is actually what Genesis was telling you all along? Could he have done that? Yes, but he did not. And so here you see some more of these various evolutionary views that the Bible writers did not adopt. And then Lucretius said that everything evolved from the earth. And so my conclusion to this section is, if you believe in evolution, it's not going to be because the Bible teaches it. It's going to be because you want to accommodate what modern pseudoscience has taught, but not because the Bible teaches it. Okay, where could you fit the millions of years? Millions of years of evolutionary time. Remember, evolution requires time. We're not observing it directly happening right now. So the story is going to be, if we had enough time, then we would be able to observe evolution happening. If a person could live for however many millions of years you need, then you would observe it. The reason you don't see it observing now is because it happens so slowly. It takes so much time to change from one kind of animal to another. And so there must be a way, if you're going to believe in the Bible and evolution, there must be a way to fit all those millions of years into the record of creation. Because the Bible seems to straightforwardly say God made everything in 6 days. So where can you fit the millions of years? Logically speaking, I would suggest there are only 3 places. You could put it before, during, or after. Is that complicated? I don't think it's very complicated. You could fit it before God started creating. This is an attempt. You're not going to be able to do it anyway. But let's say you're going to try. What are your options? Before, during, or after? So let's think about before. The attempt to put the creation, the evolution of everything into the Genesis 1 before the week really gets started is called the gap theory. And here's how it goes. You got Genesis 1:1 that says, everybody can quote Genesis 1:1, can't you? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Pause. And insert millions of years into the space between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. And this is the worst case of reading between the lines that there ever has been. This is reading between the lines. Of course, the Bible doesn't say anything about a gap. But the idea is evolution occurred during the millions or billions of years between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. And at some point during that time, the devil rebelled and was cast out of heaven. And he got some humans involved in sin. And God destroyed what he created in Genesis 1:1. So there was a creation of a beautiful world at that time. All kinds of evolution happened. All the fossils that we find that may, in some people's mind, indicate that evolution occurred. If you just say, all right, I'm going to take whatever my geology teacher tells me has happened, all this evolution has occurred. My anthropology class tells me about all the evolution. I believe all that. Where do I fit it in the Bible? It's in this gap between 1:1 and 1:2. And so geology and the discovery of all the fossils, all of that occurred. All of that laying down of those strata, which we would mostly say happened at the flood, they will say it happened in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. And then when you get to chapter 1 and verse 2, what does that say? And the earth was without form and was void, a void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. So the earth was in a different state, they would say, and this was a state of wreckage. So in 1:1, God made it all nice and pretty, and evolution occurred. Everything that Darwin taught essentially happened in the gap. Millions of years go by in the gap. And then, because God punished Satan, punished the earth, destroyed everything, it's now a wreck. And that's what verse 2 is talking about, that the earth was without form and void. God made it all nice, but because of sin and death and destruction, it's all formless and void now, by the time you get to verse 2. Does that make sense? You see what I know it doesn't ultimately make sense, but do you understand what the view is? Do you understand the theory? Any question about what it is before we talk about why it ain't so? Anybody want to ask? Okay, so you see what the gap theory is. Now let's talk about why it's not true. First of all, the Hebrew words for create and make are used interchangeably. I bring this up because one of the ways they argue is to say that create, the word create in the Bible, always means to create something from nothing. And then the word make or made refers to God working on something that already exists. So create means one thing, creating out of nothing, and make means something else. Now go to your Bible and look at how there are these two different words, Hebrew words for create and make. It is the case that those are real words and they're two different words. Okay? Look at verse 1. In the beginning, God did what? He created. Okay? But then if you keep on going down, you will see, for example, verse 7. God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And as you read Genesis 1, you will see that after verse 1, he uses the word make sometimes, or made. And they will say made really means something like remade. And see, in verse 1, he's creating from nothing. He's using the word create. And then later, you got the word made, and that means pre-existing material. He made something out of what already existed. So they draw a stark distinction between the word for create and the word for make. But look down at verses 26 and 27. If you get down to verses 26 and 27, you're going to see that create means the same thing as make. Then God said, let us make, see there? Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them, that is man and woman, rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God, now what word is it? In verse 27, God created man. So that destroys the argument right there, doesn't it? Because in verse 26, God said, let us make man. But then in verse 27, he made man, but it calls it something else. It says he created man. And what does that tell you? That in Genesis 1, creating and making are the same thing. How about one more? Let's go to Psalm 128. Actually, did I write that down wrongly? Let's look at, it's Psalm 148. I think I put down the wrong chapter. Psalm 148. This is the passage from which we get our song, Hallelujah, Praise Jehovah. And it lists all these things that God has, that praise the Lord. Creation is pictured as being able to praise God. And then look at verse 5, Psalm 148, 5. Let them praise the name of the Lord, for he commanded, and they were created. So that tells you that even though various things are said to have been made in Genesis 1, here in Psalm 148, the summary of all the creation is discussed. You've got the heavens, you've got the angels, you've got the hosts, the sun, the moon, the stars, the waters. Let all those things, and this is a picture of the whole creation, and then he says, he commanded, and what happened? Were they made or created? Well, here the word's created. And that just shows you that anything that is said to be made in Genesis 1 is created. And those two words are used interchangeably. So that's one of the pillars for the gap theory, is trying to distinguish between those two words, but that doesn't work. Now let's go back to Genesis 1. I know this is a little bit tedious, but if you ever have a conversation with somebody who's trying to be a theistic evolutionist or an evolutionist who believes in God and the Bible, then you're going to have to talk about things like this. And it's faith building, I think, to see that the Bible answers this kind of error before we even ever encounter it. So now we come to Genesis 1 and verse 2. And it says, the earth was formless and void. The gap theory people are going to want to translate that word was by became. They don't want it to just say the earth was formless and void. They want it to say it became formless and void, because that sounds like what happened in between verses 1:1 or chapter 1:1, chapter 1:2 really was an event in the gap. But there's no reason to translate it that way. Most of the time, that word just means was. And so there's no reason to change the meaning of the word here. And then the phrase formless and void, there's a Hebrew phrase, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but it does not mean something that used to be in good shape but now is wrecked, or something once in a state of repair but now ruined. It just means not finished out yet. So think about the difference between a car that doesn't have all of the detailing put in on it yet. A brand new car, and the last few people to assemble it have not finished doing all their assembling. You know, maybe the trim hasn't been put on, or maybe the tires haven't been put on yet. That's not a wrecked vehicle, is it? Would you look at the car that's just toward the end of the assembly line and maybe they need to add a few more parts before it's finished? Is that a vehicle that used to be in good shape but now it's destroyed? No, it's just not fully formed yet. And that's what the phrase formless and void means. It doesn't mean something that used to be in good shape but now is wrecked. And so without doing much study in Hebrew at all, you can tell that this is a misinterpretation of the passage. And then finally, and this may be the easiest way to argue about it, it is that the gap theory implies sin and death before Adam. And that's backwards, isn't it? Because the New Testament makes it very clear in Romans and 1 Corinthians both that Adam was the first man and that Adam and Eve were the first to sin. And so through Adam came sin and death. Human death had not occurred prior to Adam's sin. But if the gap theory is true, then possibly hundreds of thousands and millions of people died before Adam ever came onto the scene. You see what we mean? Okay, so those are the problems for the gap theory. Any questions or comments about that? Again, these kinds of theories, you may say, well, I don't care about the gap theory. I haven't been hearing about that. But in the religious world, especially in the denominational world, it is rampant to try to make Genesis 1 teach something other than what it evidently teaches. And so if we ever do encounter this, as we study with people, we need to be ready to defend what it really says. Okay, now, we've talked about before. Shall we now discuss what about during the creation week? Could we fit the millions of years into the days, the various days of creation? And as you know, this is going to be called the day-age theory. And there's even a very popular Bible handbook that I use. I think it's a very good tool called Halley's Bible Handbook. How many people have one of those? We got a bunch of people who have Halley's Bible Handbook, and I'm glad you do. It's a good thing to use. But like everything else, you have to take the meat and leave the bones, don't you? He says, whether the 7 days were days of 24 hours or long successive periods, we do not know. The word day has variable meanings. Well, that's true of a lot of words. And in fact, words have very little, if any, meaning apart from their context. We'll say a little bit about that in a moment. But let's just let the Bible define the word day for us. Repeatedly in Genesis 1, we have this phrase, the evening and the morning, don't we? And that means there's a period of light and there's a period of darkness, and that makes up what's considered a day in Genesis 1. And that sounds like what's considered a day right now. And it is because those were just ordinary days in the chapter. I don't know how God could have been clearer about discussing what a day was rather than saying it's two things. It's a period of light and a period of darkness, and then it starts over again. Then you got another day after that. So it's very clear. Furthermore, in chapter 1 and verse 14, God differentiates days and years, and also from seasons. And so if a day is supposed to be an epoch or an eon, then what is a year supposed to be? You see how the words just start to become totally meaningless. If you say a day can be an indefinite expanse of time, well then what would be the point of introducing the concept of a year? If a day is already millions of years, then to add years to our discussion just makes it confusing, doesn't it? So we should just say day means what a day means today, and a year means what a year means. And obviously, Genesis 1 was written to help people understand what happened at the beginning of the world, not to confuse people about what happened at the beginning of the world. Can you imagine Moses writing this down and saying to himself, now let me make this as inscrutable as possible? Do you think God inspired Moses to write a document that was just hopelessly not understandable? If you say that a day is an eon, then that's what you're doing to the text. It becomes unintelligible. Okay, we had a couple of comments and then we'll go. Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. George, go ahead. That's right. Yes. Yes, it explains it, doesn't it? Okay, we have one more comment, and then we have hopefully we'll finish out this discussion. Yes, sir.
Is it not common that we sometimes tie in this day and time with a coordinate conjunction, meaning equal, meaning more than just a day?
Yes, sometimes the word day is used in a non-literal context, and let's look at that for a minute. As I said a moment ago, words always require a context. For example, what if I use the phrase, men are wise? What am I talking about? Do I mean males? Or do I mean humankind? Also, am I talking about all men? Or just some? All I've said is, men are wise. Well, which men are we talking about? Obviously, the men in here would fall into that category. But then what does the word wise mean? The context is going to determine. What if I'm talking about the purchase of used cars and I say men are wise? I'm probably talking about in finding a good deal on a car. But what if I'm talking about a different context, like Bible knowledge or something like that? The context is going to determine what I mean. Same is going to be true with the word day. Or what if I say he got blown up again? Who is he? Also, what does blown up mean? If you're talking about football and you say that somebody got blown up, what do you mean? He got tackled and hit really hard and fell to the ground. And the commentator might say, wow, he got blown up. But we don't mean that he got blown up like with a bomb. Or how many times had he been blown up before? It says he got blown up again. Well, what does the again refer to? Is this a habit? You see, the context will determine these things. So let's look at the word day and think about its context. The numerical adjective, first day, second day, third day, limits the meaning, doesn't it? While it is true that sometimes we mean in Caesar's day, which is not a 24-hour day, when we talk about in Caesar's day, we mean during his general period of history. Or what if I say, well, back in my day, am I talking about a 24-hour period? Or am I talking about my youth, for example, or when I was a young adult back in my day? Whenever it's modified by a number like first, second, third, the word yom, which is translated day in Genesis 1, always refers to a literal 24-hour day. And I've given you some examples. And the context makes it such that if you try to make it mean something else, it will not make sense. And so here are just some examples. We don't have time to look at them. It's just too brief of a class. But let's see some places where the word can be used non-literally, but the context clarifies it. For example, you're in Genesis 1. Look down at chapter 2 and verse 4. It's interesting that God can use, even in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, God knows how to use yom in a literal way and in a non-literal way. Look at verse 4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven. Does that mean he made the heavens and the earth in one literal 24-hour day? Or is it talking about the time period, which, as we've already seen, is a 6-day creation week? It seems that it's talking about in that time period. Or let's look down at Genesis chapter 26 and verse 18. It says, "Then Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham." In the days of his father Abraham? Is that talking about a few literal 24-hour days, or is it talking about, and this seems to me to be the case, during Abraham's time? Yes, it's talking about back during Abraham's day when those wells were dug. And so God can use the word either way he wants to, literal or non-literal, but we've got to let the context clarify what's going on. And then I think I mentioned before the connection between Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11, in the discussion of the Sabbath day, and God compares the creation week with the Hebrew work week. And he makes the creation week the basis for the 6-day work week with a 7th day of rest. And obviously the Hebrews understood that they were to work for 6 24-hour days and then take a day off. If a day is a million years in Genesis 1, and they are free to understand day that way in Exodus 20, then you might work your whole lifetime and never get a day off, which would be sad, wouldn't it? Because you only live 80 years, and look, a day is an eon, so you didn't make it to the Sabbath. I think I'd be arguing for my lifetime to occur during the Sabbath eon, wouldn't you? And that way I'd never have to go to work. It's just a thought. I'm just kidding. I love my work. But let's say this. We got one more minute left, and I want to bring to your attention one quotation, and then I'll let you go. This is maybe the greatest expert on the Hebrew language of the 20th century, James Barr. And here's what he says about the Hebrew word yom. And he wasn't conservative, he was a liberal, but he says something very helpful. He says, "Probably, so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writer," or he would say writers, he wouldn't say that it's necessarily got to be one writer apparently, that the writers of Genesis 1 through 11 intended to convey to their readers the ideas that a creation took place in a series of 6 days which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. Or to put it negatively, the apologetic arguments which suppose the days of creation to be long eras of time, the figures of years not to be chronological, and the flood to be merely a local Mesopotamian flood are not taken seriously by any such professors as far as I know. What's he saying? He's saying, I'm familiar with professors of Hebrew. He was at Oxford. James Barr was at Oxford. He said, I know what Old Testament scholars say about the days in Genesis 1 through 11 and about the flood. And nobody, so far as I know, thinks. They may not believe in creation. They may be atheists. They may not believe in the flood of Genesis. They may hate the Bible. I mean, as a literal document. They may not believe anything that we believe that the Bible teaches. They may not believe in Jesus, so forth. He says these people do not think that the author or authors, in his case, of Genesis were trying to teach the day-age theory. They do not believe that the writer of Genesis was trying to get people to believe in a local flood rather than a worldwide flood. They believe that the author of Genesis, as Hebrew scholars, not as Christians, not as people who are trying to convert people to the New Testament church, as Hebrew scholars. He says they believe that the writer of Genesis was trying to get people to believe in a 6-day creation week and that there was a global flood. Isn't that powerful? Because he's not on our side. He's just saying you cannot make an argument from the text of Genesis 1 for the day-age theory or for a localized flood instead of a worldwide flood. That is powerful evidence. It's good to hear things from people who are on our side, but sometimes it's helpful to hear things from people who aren't on our side, who admit that the claims we're making for the historical accuracy of the Bible are good. Okay, that's all the time we have. I'm sorry. We'll catch up with your comments next week if you like, and we'll discuss various other arguments. Thank you for your attention.